very nice, pleasant visit together. And then I was getting ready to leave. And when I was getting ready to leave, I noticed that this light wasn't working. And I said, Marlene, why is that light not working? She said, I don't know. And I said, well, give me a stool and let me get up there and check about this light. I said, it may just need a new bulb. She said, no, don't worry about it. I said, Marlene, let me do this for you. She said, no, don't bother with it. I said, Marlene, if you don't let me look at this light, I'm going to move in with you. She said, here's the stool. Okay? And so she got the stool out. All she needed was a light bulb replaced. She had no business doing that herself. It was way too high for her. But, see, that's sometimes a struggle for some widowed people. They need some help. And sometimes it's just the littlest of things. But if we don't interact with them, we'll never know what it is they need. Let me, Tim, is the microphone working?
Is the green light on?
Yes.
Try it now.
Okay. Is it working now? This is what you call technical difficulties within our control, I hope. How are we doing? Oh, there we are. Okay, we're okay now. Okay, what I consider the most important session of all. From one widow to another. Here is how one chapter in that book starts. Imagine a single event that will dramatically change your calendar, your checkbook, your friendship network, the contents of your refrigerator, the temperature you set your thermostat, your outlook on your future, and your connection with your children. And that's not all. Your appearance may change, your emotions, your sleep patterns, your theology, your social status, and possibly your address. I experienced most of these changes and more beginning April 21, 2006. The day I became a widow. I don't like that word, and I still will not check that box to identify myself. There's a book called The Widow's Mite back there on that display table. Let me read to you a paragraph out of that book. If I could have one positive thing come from Dale's death, it would be the ability in words to describe the utter, overwhelming sadness of the loss. One of the primary differences between the death of your spouse and the loss of anyone else is that you have a level of physical intimacy with your spouse that you just don't have with other people. That, combined with the sheer amount of time you spent together, heightens the loss. Until you live it, I'm not sure you can totally wrap your thoughts around the crushing magnitude of losing a spouse. Even as a strong woman with a powerful faith walk, a wonderful family, and a large support group, I was brought to my knees by Dale's death. I've totally changed how I think about life, marriage, and myself. Whatever happens in my future, I will never be the same. There is a book out there on that display table called Getting to the Other Side of Grief. It's written by a male and a female. Both lost their mates. One had a counseling background. The other had a nursing background. The female with the nursing background at one point in the book wrote this: I wanted to kill myself. Going to bed alone at night was so hard. I prayed to God He would let me die. I wanted out of this life. In a book called The Widow's Mite, the widow wrote, the space inside of me, previously occupied by that passionate relationship, was strangely empty. I went from having someone think I was the most amazing person on earth to feeling invisible and vacant. Another widow wrote a book called The Confessions of a Mediocre Widow. She said, during the first year, it seemed like I was in a constant state of emotional agony. I would sit with a photo album in my lap and flip through the pictures of a man I couldn't believe was actually gone. Another widow remarked this: ever since this happened, I feel like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Like a tornado has picked up my house and is spinning it, and I just want to know where it's going to land. One widower, Fred Colby, wrote this: the greatest fear I had during the earliest stages of my grief was that I was going crazy, was losing all control of my thoughts, and that I might make decisions harming me, my family, or my friends. That included suicidal thoughts. A lady wrote this: right after Elaine died, I remember telling people it will take some time, but you'll get used to it. I wasn't sure what getting used to it actually meant, or if it was even possible. All I knew was that Elaine was gone. I had to take charge of my life and get used to being on my own. At first thought, getting used to a new life, a widow's life, I thought wouldn't be terribly difficult. I was lucky. I didn't have to move or look for a job. I didn't think I had a lot to get used to. Then, getting used to it started to catch up with me. The first invitation without his name on it. Taking a vacation with a girlfriend rather than my husband. Every time I was asked about my marital status, I had to reply, widow. Then there is sleeping alone, going to a movie, waiting for test results. After 10 years of being a widow, in many ways I have gotten used to taking the ride alone. You do get used to doing his chores, making decisions in general, and handling your life on your own. It's the little personal things that I know I will never get used to. Why would I want to? Having to empty the dishwasher, no one to share a good night kiss with, take my arm when I was crossing the street, still remind me daily that I still miss Lane and will never get used to the loneliness that I feel. I could go on and on reading those kinds of observations written by people who have lost their spouse. I'll conclude with this one. I just cleaned my husband's room and washed the last sheets he slept on. So hard. Probably could have washed them with tears. And then she says, this feels like my heart is being ripped from my body. You want to know what it's like to lose a spouse? You've just heard from several people. There's the loss, and then there is the reality of living with that loss every day and every night. You know, we're never going to know about how to effectively help people who are struggling with unique situations unless we come to understand a little bit better about what their situation is. Riley, could you go back and see if you can find some of those forks, if there's any back there? We'll need them after a bit. I want to tell you, before we get into some of the other slides, about Millie. No offense to all the other widowed people I've ever met, but she's my favorite widow. I met her on the north side of Cincinnati, Ohio, at the Groesbeck Church of Christ, where I was preaching in a gospel meeting. And the preacher there, Mark Phillips, who's a friend of mine, came to me and said, Dean, I've got this 90-plus-year-old lady who wants to take you out to lunch. Well, having had excessive exposure to the female gender, I knew not to say no, especially if she was 90-plus. So I said, Mark, just go ahead and work it out. Whatever day or time is fine. And so she took me to a Japanese restaurant. I didn't even know 90-plus-year-old ladies ate at Japanese restaurants. But we went to this Japanese restaurant, and after the waiter took our order, I did with her the same thing I do with all widowed people when I'm with them alone in a more personal, quiet setting. I said, Millie, tell me your love and loss story, because I enjoy hearing about how people met, about their life, and then how their marriage ended. I think there's a great deal of value in learning about what other people have been through. And so she said, this guy and I, we were married for 63 years. He was a good man. He was a good father. She said that he got cancer, and she explained about how she cared for him. I was just so impressed with her story. It was so touching. And then after she told me about that 63-year marriage, she said, but that wasn't my first husband. And I was shocked by that. And I said, Millie, tell me about your first love and loss story. She said, well, I was 19 years old. She said, my husband was in Patton's army in the Battle of the Bulge, and he died there. She said, I had him buried in France. And I can quote exactly what she said after that. A decision that to this day I regret. That's exactly what she said. Now, let me add to the story. She was not only 19 years old when she was widowed, she also had a child with that fellow. I think she said he was a year and a half old, the child was, and she was also pregnant. He's in Patton's army and he dies there. So she's 19 years old. This is 1944, I think. 19 years old. A child and pregnant. How did Millie survive? How in the world did that young lady survive? Boy, what an inspirational story that she was. And so after I met her and heard her story, sometimes I would tell her story when I would do workshops. And then what I would do, sometimes I would call her then. And I would tell her, Millie, I want you to know that I told your story. That I want you to know that your story of love and loss and your fight to survive and rebuild your life, I want you to know that that story has value and other people are being encouraged and inspired by your life. A couple of years ago, she died on July 4th. I love widowed people, and I love their stories. I love their stories of love, and I appreciate greatly their stories of loss. I didn't know much about life after loss until I started living it. It's a different life. What are the risk factors of becoming a widow? The first thing you have to do is you have to get married. And the second thing you have to do is you have to stay married and keep living. And those three things put you at risk of becoming widowed. At the start of the marriage, how do we concede that this is not going to last forever? What do you hear, anybody, what do you hear at the wedding ceremony that gives you the distinct impression this is not going to be forever? Until death do us part. Okay? So we make that concession at the ceremony and everybody there hears it. Now, what talk is there about that reality after the ceremony? Sometimes none. Marriage has a very distinctive and a very memorable, a very, hopefully, romantic, well, unless you go to Walmart that day, beginning. What a beautiful thing to begin life together with somebody that you love and that loves you. Just as surely as there is a memorable beginning, there is also a memorable end. I love the way one lady was described, one of my Facebook friends. She was the wife of a preacher, a handicapped preacher, as a matter of fact. She took care of him. She worked full-time as a teacher, English teacher, up in West Virginia. Took care of her husband. He continued to preach even in his handicapped condition. When he died, one of her Facebook friends described her this way in regard to her marriage. She hoed her row to the end. I thought, what a cool way of talking about her devotion to her husband. She hoed that row all the way to the end. You know, some of the most valuable resources for marital success and marital happiness are the people who hoed their row all the way to the end. They have tremendous experience. Those 19 people that I told you about that were together in Villa Rica, Georgia, just a few days ago, with those 19 people, there were 665 years, close to 665 years of marriage. And they hoed their rows all the way to the end. Man, you talk about some valuable experiences that they've had. We need to make sure we use that resource in our local churches. Now, I want to open it up and ask you, tell me something that you would commonly associate with widowhood. From what you know, what would you commonly associate with widowhood? And let me give you an idea, a suggestion. In Medina, Ohio, the second workshop I ever did, about halfway back, there was this guy named Denny Hickerson that was sitting back there with his wife and his children. I had Denny at camp when he was a teenager. And he raised his hand when I brought this up. He raised his hand and I said, okay, Denny, get us started. Give me something that you would associate with widowhood. He said, old. I said, you're exactly right. That is commonly associated with widowhood. But you know, you don't have to be old to be widowed. Let me tell you about Cynthia. She and her husband were big cotton farmers in West Tennessee. He went out one day to weld on a truck that had a diesel tank on it that he would use to take fuel out to his equipment in the field to fuel that equipment up. He went out there to weld on that tank. That tank had 75% diesel fuel in it, 25% fumes, which was not a problem, except what he didn't know is there was a pinhole leak in that tank. When he cranked up that welder, it blew up. It blew the building up, the machinery, and blew his body out of the building. His 29-year-old wife went and got comforters and blankets and soaked them in the bathtub and ran out and threw them on the body of her husband. He was life-flighted to Memphis, Tennessee, about an hour away, and he died a couple of days later. 29 years old. I can tell you about Buffy in her late 20s, who was a school teacher in southwest Georgia. Every day she called her husband at lunchtime. This one particular day, she had this conversation and she was concerned. She hung up the phone. She decided to go home. The commute to home, though, was 45 minutes. On the commute home, she called her father, who was in law enforcement, and said, Dad, I'd like for you to go to the house. I'm concerned about him. When her father got to the house, he had taken his life. They had a little son. Here she is in her late 20s. I can tell you about Brittany, who's an educator in West Tennessee. And Brittany was married for about 1,300 days, a little over 1,300 days. I know that because she wrote a blog about after this happened for a good while as part of her therapy. Her husband, Bradford, was driving up in Trenton, Tennessee, and had a horrible accident, and he was killed. And she was widowed. She's in her 20s. You don't have to be old to be widowed. You don't have to be old. That's why when I do these widowhood workshops, the number one target audience for me is married people. Because all married people are prospective widowed people. And you could be widowed at any time. But what would we commonly associate with widowhood besides old? Anybody? We can come up with at least 8 or 10. Give me some. What would you associate with widowhood? Loneliness. Almost always, that is the first thing that's mentioned. Some of you may know probably Kathy Lee Gifford, not personally, but you know her because she was an NBC hostess on the Today Show for a good while. Her husband, Frank, was a famous football player. And I think it was 2015 when he died. I have read an article in the AARP magazine. I'm not really old enough to be reading that yet, but I just happened to catch this article that was written based on an interview with her. I've also watched a video interview with her. When she left the New York City area and moved to Franklin, Tennessee, down in the Nashville, Tennessee area, do you know why she said she moved there? Here's what she said. She said, I can quote it exactly, I am painfully lonely. Painfully lonely. Those are the same two words that were used by a man in his 80s when I called him to invite him in West Tennessee to our monthly fellowship that we were having there for widows and widowers in the area. And I called and I invited him, and we engaged in this conversation for a while. And in the course of the conversation, it was interesting that he used those same two words. He talked about how he was painfully lonely. That it's a loneliness like you have never experienced before, because it's a loss like no other experience in life. None. Do you know there are 8.7 billion people in this world? Now, my little brain just cannot comprehend that number, okay? But 8.7 billion people in this world. Do you know how many people are in your marriage? There's only 2. That makes that other person and your relationship with that other person extremely special. It needs to be treated that way, especially in light of how frail and unpredictable human life is. Yeah, loneliness is a huge issue. Name me something else that would be commonly associated with widowhood. Poverty. 3 to 4 times more likely. The Census Bureau or Social Security Department, I forget, one of these two, in doing a study, said that elderly women who are widowed are 3 to 4 times more likely to live in poverty than the elderly females who are married. Yeah, sometimes there are financial issues that go with widowhood. Something else. What would you associate with widowhood? I think y'all ate too much. Depression. In West Tennessee, there were about probably 40 people there that night. Before we finished up that evening, I said, does anybody have anything that they'd like to share or like to say before we dismiss? Rachel raised her hand. And Rachel said, how many people here are on depression meds? Now, why do you think she asked that question? She was. How do sometimes some people feel when they're on depression meds? Ashamed? Embarrassed? Okay. Now you got to remember, when you get a bunch of widowed people together, I'm telling you what, if they know that they're with widowed people, they'll say stuff they wouldn't say other places. There is an honesty and a transparency when you have that kind of setting. I said, well, I don't know, Rachel, how many people here are on depression meds? About 1/3 of the people in that group raised their hands. So I proceeded to talk to them about that. I said, look, there are mental issues, there are physical issues. There's no reason to be embarrassed by a physical health issue. There's no reason to be embarrassed by a mental health issue, including depression. There are sometimes we need. I remember when I was doing caregiving, it was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. There was a point in time where my primary care physician, who was a deacon at church there, I remember going for a doctor's visit with him. And he said one day, he said, Dean, do you need depression medication? I said, Todd, give me a little bit longer. You know, I was always wanting to push that down the road. I said, give me a little bit longer. See, he recognized, he saw in me, just from my physical condition. It was the only time in my life I ever went back to my high school weight of 185. You know, caregiving is another area where we really need to be compassionately supportive of people who are doing caregiving, because that is extremely stressful. How about something else that you'd like to to mention you would associate with widowhood? Change in social life. We live in a coupled world. When you're widowed, you become a social misfit. Remember what I told you about the lady I was talking to on the phone just this week? You know, she was divorced a few years ago. Her closest personal friend would not invite her over with other couples because that would make an odd number. Her closest friend. So you become a social misfit. And you have to deal with that reality. Let me share with you a bunch. Whenever you lose your spouse, you're going to grieve. And the reason you're going to grieve is because you have lost a valued part of your life. The two become one flesh. You were part of a couple. Now what are you when the couple no longer exists? That's an identity crisis. And you grieve that loss. It's kind of like, you know, one reason why, you probably are familiar with that statement that God made through Malachi in the Old Testament, where God says, I hate divorce. You know, one reason why I think God hates divorce is it's a violent act. Just like the loss by death is a violent act. How violent would it be for your arm to be pulled off of your body? That's a pretty violent act. When two become one, and then half is pulled away from the whole, that is a painful experience. And you're going to grieve that. That's what we human beings do when we lose something of value. And there's no reason to apologize or be embarrassed when we're grieving. We need to grieve deeply. That's why I do these grief workshops that I do. We need to understand that that is natural, that is normal. The grief, I call it the grief monster. The grief monster, when it comes to visit you, at first he comes and you view him as your enemy. But he's not your enemy, he's your friend. You have no idea how long the grief monster is going to be at your house. But over time, what you need to learn is that grief monster is not your enemy. He's not a threat, he's your friend. He's going to help you heal, is what he's going to do. But you've got to engage in that deep grieving. Part of that, for most of us, is going to be tears, a boatload of tears. What do we say when we're in the presence of somebody else and we tear up or start crying? What do we say? I'm sorry. What do we have to apologize for? Absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, crying in the presence of other people is of great value to them. What have you taught them when you burst out in tears or start welling up or start crying? What does that tell them? It's hurting. You're hurting. Loss is hurtful. It's painful. They need to understand that. If we did more of that kind of thing, we might have less people walking away from us when they ask us, how are you doing? And we say, I'm not doing well. Show them physically. That might make an impression on them. You're going to have a heartache like you've never had before because you've lost like you've never had before. And you're going to start asking questions that you've never asked before. Questions about yourself, questions about your brothers and sisters in the Lord, questions about your family, questions about your in-laws. You're going to have all kinds of questions that you've never thought about before, and you may have a crisis of faith, a spiritual crisis. And you know what you have to apologize for when you face that? Again, absolutely nothing. Because you know what? That's a part of the human struggle. One of the things that we're going to make reference to, if I don't get Alzheimer's before the morning, is the fact that faith does not give you the answer to all of your questions. Faith will give you the ability to live without answers. But it takes a long time to wrap that concept around your brain and around your feeler too. But it's not an uncommon thing for a widowed person to struggle with their faith. In addition to that, you've got the loneliness that we mentioned, the identity crisis. Who am I now that I'm no longer somebody's husband or somebody's wife? You may find yourself in financial jeopardy. You're dealing with forced change, and it's very frustrating and very scary. You may have dreams. You may have a deafening silence in your house, especially in the wintertime when it gets dark early. That's a great time to call a widowed person, by the way. You have this emptiness, this dependence that you struggle with, and you have stress like you've never experienced before in your life. You may have anger toward the person who's left you, anger toward God. Jackie was in the shower sometimes after her husband passed away, and she would beat the walls of the shower, screaming, "Why did you leave me?" Well, he didn't choose to leave her, but see, that's the way she was feeling. See, your feelings are not always consistent with reality, and that's going to cause you to have emotions like anger, and you may worry about stuff you've never worried before because you shared your life with somebody else, and you know if you're down, they pick you up, or if they're down, you pick them up, and so having that partner makes life struggles a whole lot easier. And then you've got the fears about your future and the restlessness sometimes that you experience. On the evening of December 30th, that was the day my wife was buried. She died on Christmas morning. The memorial service was December 30. She's buried on a hill. And it was very cold. You know, this is Northeast Ohio, end of December. It was snowing. The wind was blowing. We had to have the committal service at the bottom of the hill under a tent. So we did the committal service. And then we left from there and went home. Later, just after dark, the funeral director called me. He was a personal friend of mine. The people who took care of my wife's body and helped us with that memorial service were not just fellow community members or fellow professional people in the community. They were my friends. I deeply appreciated that husband and wife team. I hated ruining their Christmas morning by calling them to come get my wife's body. That night on December 30th, he called me. And he said, "Dean, we had difficulty getting the vault down in the hole." In Ohio, I don't know about Mississippi, but in Ohio, you can't bury somebody in a casket. The casket has to be in a vault and lowered into the ground. And he said, you know, it was on a hill, and they have all this equipment that they have there. And because of all the snow that was on the ground, the equipment was sliding around. And what happened was the vault got kind of whopper-jawed, and they just couldn't get it down there. And so it was half up above the ground and half below the ground. I thanked him for being transparent and telling me that. That's what friends do. Friends are transparent. And I thanked him for that. How do you think I slept that night? And sometimes the dreams you have, and it is not an uncommon thing. I've had dreams recently about my late wife. That is not an uncommon thing for people who've lost their spouse 10, 15 years later. I know these people personally, and I've asked them about this sort of thing. It's not an uncommon thing. And the vast majority of times for them, it's kind of like a visit. It's kind of a helpful thing. And they hate it when the dream ends and they have to wake up. But again, that's something that, you know, because we haven't talked about this stuff, a lot of people don't know about that. And that's the reason why sometimes there is that issue of the restlessness and the difficulty sleeping at night. And it was at the first place that I ever did a widowhood workshop in Chester, West Virginia, that there was this older gentleman. He had to be in his, older, anybody, I call an old person anybody 10 years older than me. By the way, I'm 68. So if you're 78 or above, you're in that category. So he was, I'm thinking probably early to mid-80s. He came to me, bald-headed guy, glasses, and his eyes were beginning to get watery. And he said, "Dean, I'd like to suggest you add one thing to that list." Now, that's when this list was a lot smaller back then. I hadn't done near the research. But what he suggested, he said, you need to put suicidal thoughts on that list. Now, this was a brother in the Lord. You know, just like I read to you about that nurse in that book, The Other Side of Grief, she said, very frankly, I wanted the Lord to take me. I wanted to kill myself. You know, have you ever thought about it being that extreme? It can be. It can be that extreme. That excruciating that somebody would feel that way. Well, why is this so difficult? Well, here's the answer. It's called one flesh. That phrase, that's a unique phrase used to describe only one human relationship, and that's this one, the one we're talking about. And when you stop to think about what marriage is, if you do it right, if you want a magnificent marriage, here is how you do it. Total giving of total self for a total lifetime. That's the magic formula. That's the prescription. If you want a magnificent marriage, I don't care how poorly the world treats marriage or what laws we have about marriage or divorce or any of that stuff. If you want to have a magnificent marriage, right there's the key. Two people who are totally buying in. Total giving, total self, total lifetime. That is going to make a magnificent marriage. Now, when you have treated your relationship like that, and now you no longer have that relationship, how's that going to make you feel? Empty. You're going to feel very empty. And that is the struggle of widowhood. We're all individuals. We're not made with the same cookie cutter. Our relationships are different. Human relationships are, some friendships are different from other friendships. Some marital relationships are different from other relationships. Family dynamics are different. If you have a dysfunctional family, we made reference to that passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5. How effectively is a family going to minister to their mother, their father, their grandmother, or grandfather if they have a dysfunctional family? Family dynamics makes a whole lot of difference in how people grieve and how they experience life after loss. And then you've got people who have been married a very short time, and you have people who've been married a very, very long time. The experiences that we have during the course of the time that we are married are going to factor into what our widowhood is like, because we're no longer going to have those experiences anymore. And then there is different degrees of faith. Some people have no faith. Some couples and married people have no faith. Some have a little faith. Some have a strong faith. Some have a faith that's in a crisis mode. And sometimes some things happen that you just don't comprehend would ever happen. Imagine this. There's this couple that are not getting along. So there's a lot of friction, and they're moving toward divorce. They have two boys, 14 and 12. He takes the two boys to their lake house, and he drugs them. And then he kills them, and he kills himself. Previous to that, he texted his wife and said, "You're going to have to live with this the rest of your life." How do you think she's doing? This whole loss thing is really hard. And for some people, it's a lot harder than others. And there are reasons why, for some people, it's a lot harder than others. But again, if we don't know this, we'll never be able to effectively help these people. Did you find any? Okay, all three of you girls. Okay, those of you who are widowed, can you open that? Did you open that? Is it open? They're hard to open, Riley. No, they're not. She's 13. She knows everything. Okay, those of you who are widowed, my three granddaughters who are here, they're going to give you something. If you're widowed, I want you to receive a gift from the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. And may I have one of those? Okay. Make sure that you get the attention of one of my granddaughters and make sure you get one of these. It's a fork. It's a little fork. Now, let me suggest to you 2 ways that you can use this fork. If you want to lose weight, use this fork to eat with, because you probably are going to lose weight. It's a pretty small fork, okay? But I made it intentionally a small fork so that you can use it for another benefit. Another reason that we're giving you these forks is here's what I suggest to you. A widowed person, after they've lost their spouse, eventually in their life after their loss, in that journey, they come to a fork in the road. A fork in the road. Now, have you ever stopped to think about how many decisions you make? When you pick up a fork, what have you already decided? I'm going to eat, okay? Now, when you sit there in front of the plate, or the counter like we did this afternoon, you decide when you're going to start eating, what you eat, how much you eat, when and if you ever decide to quit eating, okay? See, you're making decisions when you pick up this fork. Here's what I recommend to everyone who received a fork. I'd recommend that you put this someplace at home where you'll see it periodically. Some people have put it on their kitchen counter. Some people have put it next to the chair where they sit, where they're watching TV. You might put it next to your nightstand. But put it someplace where occasionally you'll see it. When you see this fork, remind yourself, I have got to make some decisions in my life. Because my heart's still beating, the blood is still coursing through my veins. I'm alive, he's gone or she's gone. But I've still got a life. If you don't start making some decisions, all you're going to do is exist. And that's a pretty miserable excuse for living. There's a difference between existing and living. What you have to decide is, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? One of the brothers in the Lord, his name is Dwayne Tennant. The way he describes it is, after his wife passed away, he said, you know, Dean, he said, what we've got to do as widows or widowers, he said, we've got to reinvent ourselves. I think that's a good way of looking at it. Okay, what are you going to reinvent? Who are you going to become, and what are you going to do with the rest of your life? See, decisions. You've come to a point where you've got to make a decision and some other decisions about what are you going to do with the rest of your life. Now, don't start making those decisions until you've participated in deep, lasting, effective grieving. We don't need to be making big decisions when we're a mess. We've got to really pour ourselves into the grieving process. We've got to do the self-therapy necessary to help us to get to the point where we can start thinking straight. You probably have heard people say that, boy, that first year after you lose somebody, don't make any big decisions. You know, about selling the house, or maybe getting a different job. They're just some really bigger life decisions. There's a reason why that's kind of a common theory. Because we need to grieve first. That needs to be our first thing. We've got to do the deep grieving. But after that deep grieving, there is at some point in our life, we've got to decide, what are you going to do? Let me tell you about 3 things I prayed for after my wife passed away. Number 1, I prayed that God would open a door for me, an opportunity for me to continue to serve Him as a minister in the Lord's church. I had already stepped down from the pulpit before my wife had passed away, and I wasn't about to try to force myself back into the pulpit, because that could have split that church. I knew I just needed to walk away. I needed to fold my tent and walk away. And so I did that, but a year and a half after she passed away. But during that year and a half, I prayed, Lord, open a door of opportunity for me to continue to preach. Well, there was a problem with that. And I told the girls this before they left to go back home January of 2014. I said, girls, I've got 3 strikes against me. And in baseball, that's not good. I said, number 1, I'm 61 years old. Churches don't want a 61-year-old preacher. I said, number 2, I don't have a wife. I'm a widower. If you're 61 years old and you don't have a wife, you got 2 strikes against you, and there's going to be a really big curveball coming. It's going to be strike 3. My strike 3 was I'm a Yankee. My desire was to move to the southeast part of the United States because I have a daughter in Middle Tennessee, I have a daughter 40 miles west of Atlanta, and I have a daughter in Gainesville, Florida. So I have these 3 strikes against me. I knew it was going to be, and I warned the girls, this is going to be very difficult. It was more difficult than I thought. In North Carolina, in Florida, in Georgia and Tennessee, it came down to me and one other person. After they get 50 or 60 resumes, they do all the different interviews and all, FaceTime, conference calls, all that kind of stuff. It comes down to me and one other person. Every one of those times they picked the other guy. But I knew why they did. The other guy was younger than I was. The younger guy had a wife. I don't know if he was a Yankee or not, and I totally understood that, and I did not take offense to that at all. I called one of the elders at the Mountain Island Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I said, brother, I found out who you hired, and I said, I just want you to know that if I were one of the elders, I would have hired him instead of me too. He was a young man with a wonderful wife and beautiful kids, and so I finally found this little church. I became very close to this church, and I gave them a name. I called them the Little Church with the Big Heart. In West Tennessee, population 650, Murray City, Tennessee, about 80 miles northeast of Graceland. That's Memphis, for those of you who don't know about Elvis Presley. And so they let me come and help them. They were a grieving church. I was a grieving preacher, and so we were a good match. But I asked the Lord to open a door of opportunity for me. The second thing I prayed for is that God would give me the vision to see the open door. Sometimes God opens doors in our life, doors of opportunity, providentially, but we don't see them. We don't have the vision to see them. We're so busy with the nitpicking stuff, details, and hectic nature of our life, we don't see the open door. So I prayed, Lord, open me a door of opportunity. Give me the vision to see the open door. And the third thing, probably the more important thing, I said, Lord, give me the courage to walk through that door I've never walked through before in my life. Alone. Without my wife. Without my kids. Without my grandkids. The Lord provided. Eventually the Lord provided. But what about you? Or what about that person who's widowed? We've got to decide, what are we going to do with the rest of our life? Some people just exist the rest of their life, then they die. On the back wall, there are banners up here. On the back wall, there's one that says, don't die until you're dead. That's one of the 3 mottos of the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. Sometimes when people lose their spouse, they die too. Now, their heart still beats. The blood still goes through their veins. But they die when their mate dies. That's a choice. It's a choice by default. I would not recommend that for anybody who's Christian. God still can use us for His glory and for the benefit of other people. But you've got to decide first not to die. So what are you going to do with your life, the rest of your life? So, Helen Keller, you're familiar with her story. I love this quote. When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door, we do not see the one that has been opened for us. Open doors. What are we going to do with the rest of our life? What are we going to do? One thing's for sure, in regard to the marriage, you're released, you're free. Now, that doesn't mean that you feel that way, but that's God's perspective. And see, that's reality. I was driving on Van Drive in Jackson, Tennessee one day. I was listening to the radio, hearing this guy preach. I don't know what church he was from. He described wisdom in a unique way. I'd never heard this before. He said, wisdom is when you see something the way God sees it. I thought, wow, that's good. You want wisdom about church? About the Bible? About marriage, family? Financial resources? Human relationships? when you see things the way God sees them, you have wisdom. Well, this is true. Now, in your heart, you may still feel married. And that's understandable. You may feel like that for years. You may feel like that. But that's not the reality. Again, the reality and the feeler are not always on the same page. But that is true. What are you going to do with all the time and effort that you previously invested in your marriage? What are you going to do with all that time and effort? In 1 Corinthians 7, here are some phrases used to describe unmarried people. Without care, cares for the things of the Lord, pleasing to the Lord, without distraction. Now, that's not talking about in every respect. It's talking about the marriage responsibilities. When we get married, we assume responsibilities in which we glorify God as a husband or a wife or as a team together. When we're single, when we're not married, or we're widowed, or we're divorced, we're not married, so we don't have those responsibilities. You know, relationships require investment. You've got to invest in those relationships. When I met that girl when she was 15 years old that eventually became my wife, I started investing in that. I spent time with her. I talked with her. We went places together. I bought her stuff. She cost money. You know, that's the way, that's what we do in human relationships. We invest in them. Well, when you don't have that relationship, what about all that time and energy and that money? What are you going to invest it in? See, that's why there's a book back there on that display table called The Undistracted Widow. So another thing that I worked on and passionately prayed about is that the Lord would help me to focus on my relationship with Him, grow closer to Him, and grow stronger in my faith. Because I knew that that's what I needed more than anything else at that time in my life. So all the time I possibly could, I invested in that relationship with the Lord. That's how you reinvent yourself. That's how you not only survive, but you learn to thrive again. But it's a difficult decision to make. And you got to stick with it for a long period of time. Whenever you're widowed, you're more available than you've ever been before, you're more flexible than you've ever been before, and you have experience that you've never had before, and what a shame to waste that. Don't waste your pain. Don't waste your flexibility. Don't waste your availability. Don't waste your experience. Some of you may have seen that movie, I Can Only Imagine. This kid's growing up in this dysfunctional family. His dad's a monster. He loved music. He had a guitar. He wrote lyrics. He wrote music. And he existed, though, in this horrible family. His mother left him and left the family. So he's stuck with this monster of a father. And when he graduates from high school, he leaves. He gets a job setting up for this singing group. And one concert, the lead singer for the group, doesn't show up. And he overhears this as he's setting up. And he said, I can sing for you. I can be the lead singer. And sure enough, they accept him. They didn't have much of a choice because their guy didn't show up. So he started singing with them. And then they got to be like the Partridge. You'll have to Google that on your phone. The Partridge Family. They bought this bus. And they painted the bus up. And they started traveling all over the place doing these little concerts. But they were just kind of mediocre. At a turning point in the movie, the agent gets in the boy's face and says, son, you're decent, but you'll never really reach your full potential until you take your pain and you make it your inspiration. That kid went home, and over a period of time, was reconciled with his father. He went back to the group, and they started writing music that became a hit, one of which was I Can Only Imagine. Take your pain and make it your inspiration. your inspiration to glorify God by helping other people with all the flexibility and availability and experience that you have. There is a tremendous value in the life of every widowed person. Widowhood is not just about grieving. It's about transition. It's about adjustment. It's about opportunity, because the fact is, yes, that door is closed. And what's really frustrating is when you put your hand on the knob, the door's not only closed, it's locked. You can't open that door. You can't go through that door. It's closed. And that hurts. So what you have to start doing at some point in time is look for an open door. One that you'll have the courage to walk through, where you'll reinvent yourself eventually and become the new person with a new normal and a new beginning. What's your future going to be? It's going to be what you make it. What you and the Lord make it. That's what it's going to be. You know, a good place for a widowed person to serve is widowed people. Tomorrow morning, I'll tell you how many widowed people there are in New Albany, Mississippi. You can find this out about Boonville, Mississippi as well. There's a lot of hurting people in our communities. And wouldn't it be neat if we became the church that's known for ministering to widowed people? And you know who can do that best? Now, married people can do it. Married people can do it and do it very effectively. But you know who often can do it most effectively? Is widowed people. Let me read to you a quote from a book called When Life Tumbles In. Batzel Barrett Baxter. Some of you, I can tell, have enough gray hair to know who he is, who he was. Great man of God, heralded truth speaker for many years. He wrote this book, When Life Tumbles In. He died of cancer, by the way. Here's a quote out of that book. He said, "When we must carry heavy loads, we receive our greatest help, not from those who, having never carried similar burdens, stand on the sidelines and give bland advice, but from those who have been through the same valleys and have suffered the same problems." Bing, bing, bing. Have you suffered the loss of a child? Have you suffered the loss of your health? Have you suffered the loss of your home? Have you suffered the loss of your finances? Have you suffered the loss of your spouse? There's your ministry right there. What a great way to glorify God by helping people who are dealing with something that you can be familiar with, because you've been there and done that, or you have been there and are still doing it. Addie Ruth Johnson, come up here. This is the golden chest of prizes. Okay, Addie Ruth Johnson, you may turn and face the audience. Okay, this lovely young lady, she's the drama queen in the family. See, I told you. I knew when I said that. It's instinctive with her. Okay, I want to know who has been longest married. Now, even if you're no longer married, who's experienced marriage longer than anybody else in this room? Give me a number. Anybody, how about 30 over? Raise your hand. 30 and over. Oh man, y'all are old. Or you got married when you were 10 maybe. Okay, how about over 40 years of marriage? I fall in that category, 41. Okay, how about 45 or more? Man, these people are old, Abby. Over 50? Woo! 55, the double nickel. Over 50. Over 60. See, we lost some. Over 60. Over 65? 64. Hey, this is just like an auction. 64. Do I have a 64? Do I have a 63? Okay, how long? 60 what? 63. Can anybody beat 63? 2? 62 and 63. Anybody else 62 or 63? You, okay. 65 years and 9 months. There's a couple at the church where I attend when I'm home. They've been married 73 years. Can you imagine that? He's in his early 90s. 73. So they were married in the almost mid-60s. Okay, take the golden chest of prizes and take it there and let those two women, don't let him, let those two women pick out their prize. Dig as deep as you'd like to. There's a couple of books in there, a couple of journals in there. Each one of you get one. Each one of you get, and there is a pair of working gloves in there, by the way, if you'd want to get those for your husband. Boy, marriage is such a tremendous treat. I mean, boy, those of us who have been widowed, I think we can all unanimously say that it'd be great to do it again. It'd be great to have been married longer. It's just that sometimes we don't get to keep our blessings as long as we'd like. And that is a harsh reality of life. Hey, don't give them the Beware of Preacher sign. I want to give that to Colleen. She can put that on the front door of the house. I want to thank you so much for coming to these 3 sessions. Let me explain to you. Tomorrow morning at Bible study, we're going to talk about praise the Lord no matter what. The Sunday morning sermon is a study of Psalm 31, powerful psalm. It's a lesson titled What We Ought to Do When We're Overwhelmed. And I think there'll obviously be a great benefit that can be gleaned by everybody from that. Widowhood, the loss of your spouse, is not the only overwhelming experience you have in your life. But what should we do when we're so overwhelmed in our life? And then the 6th session will be after our lunch. And let me tell you about this 6th session. For the first few years of this ministry, I wouldn't go there. I didn't want to think about it, and I didn't want to do anything with it. It's about marriage after loss. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to research about it. But I ended up getting so many questions that I thought, I got to do this. So, begrudgingly, I got involved in prepping for this last session, and it's called Marriage After Loss. Let me tell you about this segment. If you have any kids, teenagers, or young adults who are not yet married, get on your phone, text them, tell them to get here tomorrow afternoon. Because this session is a very valuable session for anybody who's not yet married. There are a lot of things that we need to talk about and think about and discuss prior to making that decision to be married. That's true in regard to all marriages. It is especially true in regard to marriage after loss. There's one word I use to describe male-female relationships after loss. One word. But I'm going to write a whole chapter about that in my 3rd book. The 3rd book is going to be titled After the End Comes. There's going to be a chapter in that book about male-female relationships after loss. I can summarize that chapter in one word. Complicated. Male-female relationships are complicated. After loss, they're really complicated. But we need to think about that, and we need to talk about that. And we certainly need to talk about those things and sort some of those things out before we ever get married a second time, whether it's after a divorce or after loss of marriage by death. So that's what that 6th session is. I can't thank you enough. Brother Tim?
Yep. Just a couple of things. First of all, Dean, thank you very much. It's been very informative.
There are some people here that are so old that they might want you to use this. Could be, he said.
I'm not going there.
I can go there because I'm leaving tomorrow.
Yeah,
we have to stay.
Thank you very much. Been very informative. For those, a lot of people that weren't able to come today and everything, we want to let everybody know that all of these sessions are being recorded on YouTube. You can go to our church website. If you need that address or whatever, just get with any one of us. It's real simple. It's nacoc.us. And feel free to share this with anyone that you think that might be interested in it.
Amen.
And we really appreciate everybody being here. We have plenty of food for tomorrow. We sent out a church text. We're going to be doing we're going to be feeding the church tomorrow between services. So please feel free to join us. All of our visitors here, we really appreciate you guys coming. Come back tomorrow, and we'll be able to finish the session.
And is the afternoon session is it 1?
1:15.
1:15. Okay. Sounds good. And
Well, so now that we know that you never sleep, and for those that can't, we'll just call you, okay, for inspiration. But thank you very much. We appreciate everybody's attendance. There's a lot of literature and books and things in the back. And everybody, if you're going back home tonight, please be careful. Thank you.